Excellent.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Zychek. I'm the Administrative Coordinator at the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. Thank you all so much for joining us today to finally hear this special lecture by Ms. Catharine Arnold, which we originally had scheduled for last spring but was canceled due to COVID-19. So while we're disappointed we can't welcome Ms. Arnold in person, we are so glad she is able to join us by Zoom today. She will be speaking on the outbreak of Spanish flu aboard the USS Leviathan during World War I. The material for this lecture comes from a chapter in her most recent book, Pandemic 1918, the story of the deadliest influenza in history. Ms. Arnold is a popular historian and television presenter who specializes in dark themes. She studied English literature at Girton College, Cambridge University, where she won the Rima Alamuddin Award for creative writing. In addition to her work as an author, she is a trained journalist and spent 4 years as a reporter and feature writer on the Nottingham Evening Post. She also served as a counselor on Nottingham City Council between the years 2007 to 2019 and took the civic role of Sheriff of Nottingham in 2018-2019. Aside from the book she will be discussing this evening, Miss Arnold has published other books, including the acclaimed London Quartet, and her first novel, Lost Time, received the Betty Trask Award and will be reissued in 2020 by Endeavor. Please send all questions to me in the chat, and we will try to get through most of them at the end of Miss Arnold's presentation. So, Catherine, I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint if you're ready to go.
Certainly am, and I'd just like everybody to forgive me for having a rather croaky voice because I've got the lurgy, but I'm going to struggle along as well as I can. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start off with a PowerPoint just to give you some background to what Spanish flu actually was. We started off with a picture of the Leviathan, which we'll come to in a minute. But for the time being, I'd like to say that our first thought must be that the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 killed upwards of 100 million people in 3 devastating waves. Next slide, please. Traditionally, flu kills the old and the weak, but in a sinister twist, Spanish flu targeted the young, fit and healthy. Here's a quote from Dr. Vaughan, an army doctor, recalling his experiences at Camp Devens. The husky male either made a speedy and rather abrupt recovery or was likely to die, he wrote in his memoirs. I see hundreds of young stalwart men in the uniform of their country coming into the wards of the hospital in groups of 10 or more. They are placed on the cots until every bed is full, and yet others crowd in. The faces wear a bluish cast. A distressing cough brings up the blood-stained sputum. In the morning, the dead bodies are stacked about the morgue like cordwood. Now, as you'll see from our next slide, when Spanish flu first emerged, some people did not take the threat seriously. We have a cartoon here from a British magazine, seeing a man kind of tackled by flu, and also a political cartoon, which shows the angel of peace being overtaken by the Spanish flu, also known as the Spanish lady. And we also have a cartoon of a boy unwilling to go to school and his mother desperate for him to go back, which in many parts of the world, of course, is how a lot of parents have felt today. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. For instance, the Times of London, very influential newspaper, refused to take Spanish flu seriously. In June 1918, an editorial said, "The cause of Spanish flu was a dry, windy Spanish spring, an unpleasant and unhealthy season at all times. A spell of wet weather or moist winds would probably check the progress of the epidemic." If only you can see how seriously out of touch the Times was. But 1918's equivalent of Big Pharma soon cashed in. In every newspaper and on every billboard, there were adverts for throat sprays, traditional remedies, and even onions. As you can see, there's one onion farmer desperate to get rid of a stock because onions were traditionally thought to be a remedy for flu. One US mother actually wrapped her daughter's entire body in onions. The little girl survived, but it must have been quite a dreadful experience. Just like we do today, people try to carry on as normal. So here we have a barber shop taking its business outside. We have stretcher bearers trying to pick up the dead. And just as today, all theatres were closed until further notice. Now that did not happen in every state because organisation took place on a state-by-state basis. So some states did close the theatres, others left them open or tried to fumigate them. Next one. As you can see, people took masks very seriously. This group of ladies are Australian factory workers. And in our other picture, we have a family from Dublin in California, not Dublin, Ireland, but Dublin, California, who have put masks on. And as you can see from the close-up, they even have a mask on the cat. How you would get it to stay on, I cannot imagine. Just as today, masks became an iconic image of Spanish flu. The Red Cross distributed them for free, or you could make your own, or you could buy yourself a designer mask in silk. There's a big trend for those. And of course, there were some people who refused to wear them. So we've had people in San Francisco start an organization called the Anti-Mask League. We had, again in San Francisco, an incident where one chap refused to wear his mask, and during an altercation, he was actually shot. He wasn't shot dead, but going up without his mask in public again. Okay, next one, please. The newspaper headlines from the time are a fantastic resource. As you can see, a terrible story unfolded through the newspapers. Newspapers in the US were much more blatant and truthful about what was going on, whereas here in the UK, there was a bit of an effort to keep it quiet and cover it up for fear of morale. But you can see from these morales representing different faith groups, just what an impact Spanish flu had and how it affected everybody. One of the most chilling things that happened in the US were the lack of graves. So basically, they had to use steam hammers. They used to have to bring in firemen or police officers, anybody who could be spared to dig these graves because they literally did not have enough burial space. This next picture is absolutely heartbreaking because you can actually see some of the coffins lined up to be buried, some in the graves. And there is actually one gentleman there trying to throw perhaps some flowers in the grave or a handful of soil, as is common in some burial ceremonies. But yeah, dreadful time. So now we're coming closer to what I'm focusing on. And this is the part that the US played in the war. So here we've got the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Now this is a British ship, but obviously it was shuttling back and forth between Britain and the US. And the sinking of it really contributed eventually to America's decision to enter the war. At first, although President Wilson was in favor of it, many members of Congress were not, for a variety of reasons, perhaps too complex to go into here. So there was a gap really of 2 years between the sinking of the Lusitania, killing 128 US citizens, including the millionaire Vanderbilt, and America's decision to enter the war. One reason they entered was because German submarines were patrolling the North Atlantic, and so they were targeting US shipping. This had an effect on, obviously, the loss of lives, but also an economic effect. So this is one of the reasons why eventually Wilson was managed to persuade Congress that it should enter the war. Right, next picture. And this is the object of tonight's talk, the German Vaterland. She was requisitioned in 1918, and one newspaper journalist described her as the most gigantic prisoner of war the world has ever known. Like the Titanic, it did not lack in luxury. There's even a pool, as you can see. This is from back in the day when it was a passenger ship. And in 1918, the Navy renamed her the Leviathan after the sea monster. In this painting, you can see her escorted by the USS Allen. Obviously, as a passenger ship, she could clearly be seen, so it was necessary to paint her in dazzle camouflage. This, it was thought, would deceive the deadly U-boats. And you can get some idea of her size. Finally, you can find this on YouTube. The link will be on there. And this will show us, hopefully, never mind, we're moving a little too fast here. But when you look at these slides for yourself, you'll be able to find a link to the Leviathan leaving.
Catherine, do you want us to play that?
Right, we'll stop the slideshow there. And now you've got some kind of introduction to what was happening, into the background for my talk. I'll begin. So we've got Spanish flu, which in many ways resembles the current pandemic that we're living through. Although in one way it was profoundly different, because Spanish flu hit in the last year of World War I, the most devastating global conflict the world has ever experienced. My decision to speak to you about the fate of the Leviathan is because it illustrates the fate of so many young Americans who perished in the last years of the war. Little more than teenagers, these infantrymen, or doughboys as they were named, were shipped off from the US to join the Allies against the German army in France. And they weren't just young men. Young women signed up too as army nurses and travelled with them. Little did they know that when they set sail, they would become engaged in another greater conflict, the battle against the silent enemy of Spanish flu, which had already infected the ship. I've already mentioned the sinking of the Lusitania and how that had influenced Congress's decision to go to war. So this is the reason why on the 29th of September, the USS Leviathan transport ship was preparing to leave Hoboken, New Jersey, to sail to Brest. The USS Leviathan, along with other ships, was due to ferry around 100,000 troops across the Atlantic. On her 9th voyage to France, the Leviathan would carry troops from 10 different army organizations, including nurses and combat replacements. It was a strange twist of fate for this vessel to operate as a troop ship. She began life as a luxury liner, the Vaterland, the pride of the German passenger fleet, in 1914. It was the golden age of luxury passenger ships, the most famous example of which was the RMS Titanic, which tragically sank in 1912. When the USA entered the war in 1917, the Vaterland was resting at anchor in New York. Her German captain was unwilling to scupper her, and so Vaterland became the most gigantic prisoner of war the world has ever known. She was seized by US Customs in the early morning of April 6, 1917, and turned over to the shipping board. After 3 years in dry dock, she was finally turned over to the Navy on 25th of July 1917 and renamed the USS Leviathan after the mythical sea creature. When she was first seized, the old Vaterland had been packed with luxury goods, glassware, silverware, vintage wines, which were immediately impounded by customs. In the process, an 80-piece gold coffee service designed for the Kaiser mysteriously disappeared. But by September 1918, pampered socialites in jewels and furs had been replaced by a crew of the US Navy, consisting of 50 officers and over 1,000 men. Although the ship had been stripped and painted with striped dazzle camouflage, she remained the remnants of happier times. There was a swimming pool with Roman decorations, salons glittering with mirrors, furnished with carpets and chairs covered in brocade. But needs must. The restaurant had been converted into a mess for the troops. The swimming pool had become a baggage room. The baggage room had turned into the ship's brig or prison and a powder magazine. The once majestic ballroom and theatre had been turned into a hospital, while the gym on A deck became an isolation ward. For the transport to France, 10,000 doughboys would be crammed onto the Leviathan's 14 self-contained decks. Nobody could forget there was a war on when they saw the 3 giant smokestacks, one of them a ventilator, rearing proudly. Their slight backward slant and the wicked-looking guns that thrust themselves from unexpected places gave a fleeting impression of a crouching lion with flattened ears and bared teeth. Like many a beauty fallen upon hard times, there was a hint of tragedy about the USS Leviathan, evident in her piercing siren. As one journalist wrote, "At nightfall and in the dusk of early morning, the iron throat of the big prisoner sends forth such a wail as wrings the soul. It dies away and rises again from its own echo, like the morning cry of a world bereaved." On her first day out, the ship's log noted that a carrier pigeon, W7463, fluttered through the air and dropped dead on sea deck. A bad omen, perhaps. The USS Leviathan was the biggest ship in the world. The officer of the watch covered 12 miles on his nightly rounds, and one of the fastest, tearing through the water at 22 knots, and usually traveling without an escort, as it was believed she was too fast for the U-boats unless directly in their path. Although she is pictured in one slide with the escort of the USS Allen. The doughboys like to call her the Levi Nathan as a bit of a joke, but she had a tragic past. Several passengers and crew had died of flu on the Leviathan's previous voyage back from Brest and had been buried at sea. Among those taken sick on that journey was the young Franklin D. Roosevelt. When the Leviathan arrived in New York from France on September 19, Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was so sick with double pneumonia that Eleanor Roosevelt had to meet him with a doctor and an ambulance. According to Eleanor, The flu had been raging in Brest, and Franklin and his party had attended a funeral in the rain. The ship on which they returned was a floating hospital. Men and officers died on the way home and were buried at sea. Also among the passengers on that occasion was Prince Axel of Denmark and his entourage. When they started to experience symptoms, they didn't consult a doctor, but took to their berths with a quart of whiskey each. After a day or two, whether because of the whiskey or because of their own resistance, they were practically recovered. But Roosevelt was so weak he had to be stretchered off, and it took a month to recover. Now, just 10 days later, the Leviathan lay at anchor at Hoboken, preparing for her 9th voyage to France. The troops on board numbered 9,366, including the 57th Pioneer Infantry, September auto replacements drafts from Camps MacArthur, Humphreys, Hancock and Jackson, the 401st Pontoon Train, the 468th Pontoon Train, Base Hospital number 60, a unit of 200 female nurses, and Major General Leroy S. Lyon, CG 31st Division. The only complete unit was the 57th Pioneer Infantry from Vermont. On the night of September 27th, the men of the 57th had begun an hour's march from Camp Merritt, New Jersey, to the Alpine Landing, where ferries waited to take them down the Hudson to the Leviathan. But that night the march took far longer. Soon after the journey began, the column halted. Men suffering from symptoms of flu were falling out of the ranks, unable to keep up. The most sensible course of action would have been to abandon the march altogether and go back to quarters, but this was not an option. The army and the schedules of the USS Leviathan were inflexible. They waited for no man, healthy or sick. After a break to allow the struggling to catch up, the march resumed. But some men lay where they fell. Others struggled to their feet and even jettisoned items of kit to keep up. They were followed by trucks and ambulances, which picked the men up and took them back to the camp hospital. It is not known how many men were lost on this march. The majority of the 57th made it to Alpine Landing and then endured a cold, wet 2-hour ferry trip downriver. This was followed by final inspections on the pier at Hoboken, enlivened by coffee and rolls from the Red Cross, their first food in hours. More soldiers collapsed. Those men who could climb the gangplank and boarded the Leviathan, and they had their first sleep in 24 hours. But this period of hardship was guaranteed to challenge their immune systems. The Leviathan left port on the afternoon of September 29, and before the ship even sailed, another 120 men fell sick. Many men and several nurses were obliged to leave the ship just before we cast off our lines, said the ship's blog. Despite the setback, the Leviathan eventually set sail with over 2,000 crewmen and around 10,000 army personnel, including the nurses. The ship's log recorded that, under clear skies, we steamed slowly through the big harbour filled with shipping and proceeded straight to sea, stopping only to drop our pilot of the Sandy Hook Pilot Association, and who always piloted the Leviathan in and out of New York. But everyone felt that we would have a distressing time going over. Although the US was in the grip of Spanish flu, the army still insisted there was no reason for alarm. On October 4th, while the Leviathan was still at sea, Brigadier General Francis A. Winter of the American Expeditionary Force told the press that everything was under control and there was no reason to fear an epidemic. About 50 deaths have occurred at sea since we first began to transport troops, he claimed, eager to maintain morale by assuaging fears. The Leviathan was overcrowded, although not as overcrowded as on previous voyages when she had carried 11,000 soldiers. The ship originally had a capacity of 6,800, but this had been increased by over half. The government referred to this as intensive loading rather than the 50% overload it really was. Conditions were cramped, with men confined to quarters, huge steel rooms each holding 400 bunks. There was nothing to do except lie on your bunk or play cards. The portholes, painted deep black, with spotting light shining. Rules were precise and strictly enforced. A lighted cigarette upon a dark deck high in the air might be seen half a mile out to sea. Enabling an enemy sub to radio lookout. They generally
Catherine, you muted yourself.
I'll continue. Rules were precise and strictly enforced. A lighted cigarette upon a dark deck high in the air might be seen half a mile at sea, enabling an enemy sub to radio lookout, warning another sub just lying in wait ahead. These pests of the deep generally worked in pairs. An army chaplain was threatened with court-martial because he'd opened a port slightly in response to a dying soldier's request for air. So, as a consequence of the regulations, life on the Leviathan was spent, for the most part, in conditions of near darkness. As if to add further degrees of hellishness, the ineffectual ventilation system made little impact on the reek of sweat, and the noise levels in the all-steel structure approached pandemonium, with thousands of footsteps and shouts and cries echoing back and forth throughout the steel walls, stairs, and passageways. And then the nightmare was unleashed. Despite the fact that 120 sick men had been removed from the Leviathan before sailing, Spanish flu symptoms manifested themselves within less than 24 hours of leaving New York. To deter the spread of the disease, the troops were quarantined, sent to mess in separate groups at mealtime, confined to quarters. And at first they meekly accepted this, in the belief that quarantine was keeping them safe. Soon every bunk in the sickbay was occupied, and other men were lying sick in regular quarters. They were all marked with the deadly symptoms of Spanish flu: coughing, shivering, delirium, hemorrhaging. The nurses began to fall sick too. Colonel Gibson, commander of the 57th Pioneer Infantry, recalled that the ship was packed. Conditions were such that the influenza could breed and multiply with extraordinary swiftness. The number of sick increased rapidly. Washington was appraised of the situation, but the call for men for the Allied armies was so great that we must. Doctors and nurses were stricken. Every available doctor and nurse we utilized to the limit of endurance. By the end of the first day, 700 troops were sick, and the Leviathan was undergoing a full-blown epidemic. The horrific truth soon became apparent. Spanish flu had boarded the vessel with the doughboys and the nurses. There was an urgent need to separate the sick from the healthy and stop it spreading. Arrangements were made to put the overflow patients from the sick bay into 200 bunks in F room, section 3, portside. Within minutes, F room was filled with sick men from the decks. Next, the healthy men of E room, section 2, starboard side, surrendered their bunks to the sick and were sent down to H8. This room had previously been condemned as unfit for human habitation. By October the 3rd, the port side of E room, section 2, which held 463 bunks, had been commandeered for the sick, and the occupants were sent off to find space in the ship wherever they could. In a grim game of musical chairs, 3 sick soldiers evicted 4 healthy men, and the top bunk of the 4-bunk stack could not be used by the sick, as the nurses were unable to climb up and the sick could not climb down. During this horrific voyage, the army nurses were described by the ship's historians as ministering angels during that dreadful scourge. They were brave American girls who had left home and comfort in order to undergo peril and sacrifice abroad. The number of sick increased, with a high proportion of patients developing pneumonia. There was no room on the Leviathan for 2,000 sick and recovering men, and no way to care for such a high number of patients. The doctors and nurses who had not succumbed themselves devised a system of separating the sick from the very sick. All patients were discharged from the sick bays and sent back to their units the minute their temperature dropped to 99 degrees. It was impossible to determine just how many men were sick. Many remained in their bunks, unable to move. Rough seas made seasickness an additional complication. Young men who'd never experienced seasickness before presented themselves to the sick bay and were admitted by inexperienced medics. Meanwhile, a stream of men with genuine symptoms were turned away for lack of space. They were so delirious that they couldn't find their way back to their own quarters and simply lay down on the deck. Others walked into the sick bay unchallenged and occupied any empty bunk they could find. Conditions were deteriorating by the hour. Chief Army Surgeon Colonel Decker was the only man on board with the military experience to solve this logistical problem, but he'd taken sick on October the 1st. 2 other doctors fell sick and remained in their cabins for the duration, while 30 of the 200 Army nurses also succumbed to flu. This just left 11 doctors in charge of an increasingly nightmarish situation. The troop compartments were crammed with sick and dying men. The air rank and fetid due to the ineffectual ventilation. Without daily cleansing, the quarters became pigsties. To make matters worse, morale was low. The men came from 10 separate units, were draftees. They had no habit of obedience to a single commander or army discipline. The Leviathan was alone at sea, without an escort, with Spanish flu knocking men flat by the score every hour, and with a palpable spectre of Spanish flu stalking the ship. As the vessel sailed on across the Atlantic, the prospect of being torpedoed by a U-boat must have been positively welcome. Below decks, scenes resembled the aftermath of a battle. Colonel Gibson later described it. Scenes which cannot be visualized by anyone who has not actually seen them. Pools of blood from severe nasal hemorrhages of many patients were scattered throughout the compartments. And the attendants were powerless to escape tracking through the mess because of the narrow passages between the bunks. The decks became wet and slippery, groans. The first recorded death from Spanish flu on the USS Leviathan came at 0600 hours on October 2nd, when Private Howard Colbert, 11th Battalion, 55th Infantry, was declared dead of lobar pneumonia. He was a sailor who did duty in the hospital corps. He told the chaplain that he didn't want to die because he was needed to help at home. On the same morning, galvanized into action, the army officers ordered healthy soldiers to go down into the holds and clean out the troop compartments and bring out the sick. But in an act of mutiny, the troops refused to obey. No threat could be made which filled the men with greater fear than the pestilence below. But somebody had to clear up before the Leviathan became. Despite tradition, which dictated that the army and navy were very separate entities, the bluejackets or sailors were ordered below decks to clean up, a task which, to their eternal credit, they performed. Their actions halted the progress of the disease. There were no further mutinies. Horrified by the impact of Spanish flu, the men belatedly recognized that anarchy would make the conditions even worse. From October 2nd, not a day passed without death. 3 men died after Private Colbert, then 7, then 10. The Leviathan's war diary revealed a new horror. Total deaths to date, 21. Small force of embalmers, impossible to keep up with rate of dying. Total dead to date, 45. Impossible to embalm bodies fast enough. Signs of decomposition in some of them. There was nowhere to store the dead. The morgue was already being used to nurse the living. Initially, the deaths were carefully recorded in the Leviathan's log, with details of the victim's rank. 12:45 p.m, Thompson, Earl, private, company unknown, died on board. 3:35 p.m, Private O'Reeder died on board. But by the time the Leviathan was a week out in New York, the deaths were so numerous, the officer no longer bothered to add died on board. There were so many deaths that he was simply recording a time and a name. 2 names at 0200 hours, another 2 at 0202, 2 more at 0215. To make matters worse, identification of the sick and the dead was impossible. The sick were too ill to say who they were, and though they'd all been issued with dog tags on a chain around their necks, the tags had not yet been engraved with the owner's name, rank, and number. This meant that the names of those who died and those who survived would never be accurately recorded. Burial at sea soon became expedient. Traditionally, burial at sea was a time-honoured ritual carried out with great solemnity and dignity, but this was soon forgotten in the ongoing horror of the Leviathan's epidemic. The urgent concern was to get the bodies off the ship as soon as possible. One sailor recalled watching similar proceedings on the USS President Grant from the deck of his own ship, the Wilhelmina. Time after time, after a few muttered prayers, the ship's colours were dipped, and the plank tipped, and the shrouded corpse went into the sea. I was near to tears, he said. There was a tightening around my throat. It was death in one of its worst forms, to be consigned nameless to the sea. On October 7th, 31 more soldiers died, and the Leviathan finally entered the port of Brest. Ship's log recorded the grim death toll. Upon arrival in Brest, we had 3 sailors. The healthy and all but the sickest disembarked at once, and 969 patients were removed and taken to army hospitals. The nurses, who had saved countless lives by putting their own lives at risk, wept as they walked ashore and bade the sailors an affectionate goodbye. As a historian of the Leviathan concluded, surely they have earned a place in heaven. Of those who died on board the Leviathan, 58 were buried in France, 33 were repatriated, and 7 were buried at sea in the war zone. The ship departed from Brest after 3 days, and on the following morning at sunrise, after an imposing prayer by the chaplain, the flag was half-masted, taps were sounded, 3 volleys fired, and the coffin containing the bodies of the dead soldiers were lowered gently into the sea. But the ship was speeding at 21 knots because the crew feared imminent arrival of enemy submarines. After 7 days of mostly fair weather and without trouble from subs, the Leviathan returned to New York. The ship's log concluded with evident relief. We docked in New York on the morning of 16 October. It was a nerve-wracking voyage, and we were all greatly relieved that the trip was over. There are no clear records of the numbers who died on the Leviathan's 9th voyage to France. While the ship's deck log lists 70 deaths, Leviathan's war diary gives it the figure as 76. The history of the USS Leviathan, written by crew members after the war, states that 76 soldiers and 3 sailors died. But in another place, It states the numbers were between 96 and 3. Now, this confusion might arise from the fact that the chroniclers of the Leviathan were writing about the round trip from France back to the United States and back again, or the deaths could simply have been misrecorded as a consequence of the epidemic raging through the ship. Whatever the true figure, the dying did not stop when the Leviathan put into port at Brest. Around 286 soldiers were still on board on October 8th, and 14 of them died that day. Dozens of soldiers who'd escaped dying at sea went ashore to die on land. Those who could walk were expected to make the 4-mile journey to the army camp at Pontonaisen on foot. When they arrived, the barracks was not ready to receive them, and the camp hospital was full. Lieutenant Commander W. Chambers of the United States Navy Medical Corps was already horribly familiar with the situation. In the previous month, 1,700 cases of Spanish flu had arrived in Brest. The death rate of flu and pneumonia cases coming off the troop ships was already 10% higher than that abroad, than that ashore. Chambers ordered the local military hospital to create more space in their wards, and the YMCA transformed their hut, which had been designed as a club for the doughboys, into a 75-bed hospital. Aid stations are staffed with orderlies, and the YMCA and Knights of Columbus ambulances followed the marching column, collecting the men as they fell. 600 men, too sick to walk, were picked up on the night of October the 7th. 370 were convalescent, 150 still sick with flu, and 80 had pneumonia. 4 who collapsed during the march were dead. Over the following days, hundreds of the men who came over on the Leviathan died. Out of the 57th Infantry alone, 123 died at Kerhoon Hospital, 40 at Base Hospital 23, and several at Naval Hospital number 5. Nearly 200 of the victims of the 57th were buried at Lambezelak, overlooking the ocean. The tragedy of the vessel and ships like her were no more than floating incubators for a virus, which erupted once it hit dry land. The most extreme example was the RMS Olympic, which arrived at Southampton, England on the night of September 21st, after a 6-day voyage. The Olympic, a sister ship of the doomed Titanic, carried 5,600 men, of whom 450 had shown symptoms of flu at sea, though only 1 had died. By 4 p.m. on September 29th, the flu cases among the passengers had risen. Troops travelling on the Olympic, 1,947 people had been admitted to hospital and 140 had died. Back in Washington, the generals began to realize that the losses experienced by the American Expeditionary Force crossing to France were unacceptable. Spanish flu was already enough of a problem without the Allies importing it from America. It was understood that one factor was overcrowding, and by the time the armistice was declared on November 11th, troop ship capacity had been reduced by 30%. The generals also conceded that it was madness to send troops across the North Atlantic in the fall with little more than a blanket and no overcoat. A greater effort was made to inspect the troops' health before they sailed. Some were issued with throat sprays and face masks. Spent their entire journey to France wearing masks. It was also recommended that only units that had already experienced flu be sent overseas, on the grounds that these units might have gained some immunity. But ultimately, few of these precautions made an impact. Despite all attempts to contain her, Spanish flu remained an implacable enemy. When General March declared in a speech that every soldier who died on his way to France had still played his part in the war, The statement must have brought little comfort to their families. Following the armistice, the Leviathan was decommissioned. She had one other claim to fame when a future film star served on board as a coxswain between November 27th, 1918 and February 1919. His name was Humphrey Bogart. After a complete refit, the Leviathan returned to civilian life as an American passenger ship. Her war service making her, if anything, more popular than in her glamorous pre-war days. She flourished during Prohibition, moored in waters just outside US jurisdiction to serve medicinal alcohol to all who sailed on her. But in the end, it was the Great Depression and not the German U-boats that brought about her downfall. High maintenance, too expensive to operate, the Leviathan made her final voyage on the 14th of February 1938 to the Breakers Yard at Rosyth, Scotland. She was broken up for scrap, and nothing of her now remains, apart from the memories of those who served on her, and this celebratory address. We view the grandeur of thy bulk, and gaze with wonder and with awe at thy great magnitude and might, which surpass visions we foresaw. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a few questions from the audience that were pre-submitted, and several
Brilliant.
were referring to what similarities do you see between the COVID-19 pandemic and the Spanish influenza? And one particular question asked, what lessons can we take from the USS Leviathan and the USS Roosevelt outbreaks to avoid them in the future?
Right, okay, well, I'll start with the comparisons, the likes and the differences. I think it's worth bearing in mind that Spanish flu killed upwards of 100 million people over the course of, shall we say, really 2.5 years, 1918 through 1919, tailing off a bit in 1920. So far, the statistics that we've got are we've lost, though every loss is a tragedy for people concerned, we've lost 2 million people from COVID. Number of people killed by Spanish flu, we've lost 127,000. On one level, the losses are not so great, but in the terms of the fear and the impact on public and private life, there are many parallels. Of course, the major difference is we are not, thank God, engulfed in a major global conflict. And the reason I think Spanish flu was allowed to flourish, why they didn't target it more precisely earlier on, was because the war was everything. It was the same for the Germans. They threw everything at it, and they actually lost more troops than the Allies because, on the whole, they had their soldiers were in a worse way. They were ill, they weren't fed properly, suffered from malnutrition, so they were infected more easily. In fact, General Ludendorff said that he believed they lost the First World War because of Spanish flu and because of its impact on the armed forces. I think as it affects our lives on a day-to-day basis in the UK and the US, there are a lot of similarities. I mean, obviously everybody has their own opinion about masks and quarantines, but the virulent outbreaks of anger at mask wearing are similar. And it's interesting that an explosive device, for instance, was sent to the government offices in San Francisco in 1919. It didn't go off because certain people were just protesting, as they felt, about mask wearing. But I think it's also, to use a rather pretentious phrase, it's this sense of existential dread that we all have. This fear, especially when COVID first began, when we actually collectively began to think, how many of us are going to survive? How is this going to affect our loved ones, our children, our neighbours? And they had that too, even against the backdrop of the war. So, you know, that's one of the similarities. Obviously, we've got more to throw at it. We have more scientific knowledge. We have a vaccine, which they didn't, although they were trying to develop one. We have a greater understanding of how viruses work. But to go back to the emotional toll that COVID has taken upon us globally, I'd say that some of our experiences were very similar, and you only have to read the diaries and letters of eyewitnesses and survivors back then to be able to totally identify with what they were going through. Now, the other question I was asked was, how could we avoid things happening, like the impact on the Leviathan? I mean, first of all, one of the things that spread Spanish flu around the world was the war, because troops were being mobilized, not just between Europe and the US, but globally to every continent. And obviously the ships had to stop and refuel in other parts of the globe, and so it was spread that way. One of the most obvious things that happened for us over the last year is that the world kind of stopped. Following what they did in China, we all went through a form of lockdown. You know, there's no shipping as such, very little air travel, very little travel of any kind. So the authorities were able to prevent COVID from going around the globe in the way that Spanish flu did. And also warfare's changed. So you don't now get a situation where you need 2,000 people to sail from the US to Europe in order to fight a land campaign using very outdated military methods against another European nation. I mean, war these days, as I'm told, is more about SIG intelligence, you know, it's SIGINT and HUMINT, signal intelligence and human intelligence. So a lot more happens kind of in a way that we don't see. Obviously, there are small border walls, but nothing along the scale of World War I. Any more questions?
Yes, and I wanted to remind everyone you can also send me questions in the chat, so feel free to do that as well. We had another question. You mentioned reading the diaries of the people on the ship. We had a question on how did you get interested in this topic, and where are you finding the stats and info on those aboard?
How did I get interested? Well, I got interested in Spanish flu, and my internet connection is a bit unstable, I must warn you. I got interested for family reasons because my father was a lot older than my mother, and he always told us that his parents died of Spanish flu in around 1918 in England. That this loss had had an incalculable effect on him. You know, it had really affected him. So he was outwardly incredibly gregarious, one of those people who always has a story to tell, always holds court, you know. But there was this core of sadness. He was looking for a reassurance nobody could give. And once I spoke to other people who'd experienced the Spanish flu effect, I began to see the toxic legacy of Spanish flu. So I was interested in it as a historic event, but I was also interested in the generational inheritance of it. And without wishing to seem, without wishing to offend anybody, I would say that the impact of Spanish flu for its survivors and the families that followed was similar in impact to the Holocaust, if only because there seemed to be a couple of generations who lost people to the Spanish flu who felt like my father, bereft, guilty for still being alive, and looking for reassurance reassurance. So to me, it was an extraordinary historical event, which wasn't spoken of much until about 10 years ago, when it became a more respectable field for research. An extraordinary historical event, but also something that really affected people psychologically. It's just that oddness for me, growing up in a household where I had no family on that side at all. They were never spoken of. He would never speak about it. And it wasn't until I went, all the family around at Christmas. So that's kind of how it got me interested. That was about 2015 when I started looking into it. And I talked to my agent about it, and we kind of developed it as an idea. And at first, I found it very difficult to get anybody who was interested. My then publishers just didn't want to know. And I was lucky to get my American publishers keen on the idea, and also a small kind of independent British publisher who took me on because they could see that it had some relevance. And then, of course, it came out in 2018. And then 2 years later, suddenly everybody was thinking, oh my goodness, there's a parallel world here. There is something that's already happened where maybe we can find, if not lessons from this, we can find comfort from this, because all those guys went through that in a war, and even more people died. And so all of last year, I had sort of interviews and things where I was trying to explain the similarities, but also, thankfully, the differences.
And the other part of that question was, where were you able to find the information and read the diaries?
Oh, right, thank you. Yes, I probably missed that because of the internet. I looked at various things. Obviously, I looked on the internet. Sorry, I put my teeth back in. I looked on the internet. I looked at what was already out there. There's some fantastic resources, especially like newspapers and so on. I looked at publications that were already out there, like John Barry's excellent book. And John Barry's book about the flu is very much US based, which is fine. But of course, I had to open mine out and make it global. I went through biographies of famous people who lived through it. I looked through history books, military histories. I went to the Imperial War Museum and various other archives and kind of looked at people's letters, postcards home, letters written by servicemen. And from that and some of the existing material, which is all credited, I was able to kind of piece together this patchwork. So some stories will be familiar. They're kind of out there in the open, stories of little girls growing up in Philadelphia and seeing this at first hand, or stories of a poor Jewish boy in New York who his mother died, and then his father took him and his brother out and bought them chocolate, which was really, really unusual. And then he left them in an orphanage. They were part of 600 Jewish children who were just motherless because of the Spanish flu. So I'd say the sources come from all over, and this is very much my approach. I have this kind of like magpie approach to picking up things, some of which are familiar, some of which I've dug up, and piecing them together like a jigsaw to give a picture of what was happening.
Great, and then we'll make this the last question. You compared the Holocaust to the Spanish flu. Why do you think that nobody would speak of the flu? It is a world-changing watershed event, but most people are only vaguely aware of it.
I think because it was so horrible. I mean, I understand that in the US, there is a segment taught about the Spanish flu now as part of people's history education. But up until about 20 years ago, it was known as America's forgotten pandemic, the forgotten epidemic. I think it was because it was such an extraordinarily painful thing for the survivors and the generations that followed. It came on the heels of the war, so people had already lost family in the war, or if not in the war itself, then they'd lost them to starvation or Zeppelin raids in this country, or for other reasons. And also, it's such a horrible way to die. So although, there isn't a good way to die. I mean, nobody wants to be around when it happens. It's never a good way. But in those days, it was heroic to die in battle. It was the old kind of classical thing of, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. So you could take comfort in the fact that if your son had died in the trenches, at least he'd been fighting for king and country or for the US. But because the symptoms of Spanish flu and the way you died were so disgusting, nobody really wanted to linger on that. There's also the fact that dying in your bed of a disease was regarded as unmasculine. We all want to be able to say, I died with my boots on. This is kind of the heroic ideal. We don't want to think that our loved ones spent their last days demented because of lack of oxygen, turning blue and vomiting and worse. So I think because it was such a grisly way to die, and because it came on the heels of the First World War, it was buried. And it took a couple of generations of people like me to come along and say, well, yes, but it was one of the most influential events of the 20th century. It changed so many things.
Great. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today, Catherine. And please let me know if you have any questions in the audience, and I will see that Catherine gets them. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing it.